This is a portrait to flee a country for. Hi, welcome to Stories of Art. My name is Carel Huydecoper and today I'd like to tell you the story of this spectacular portrait painted by John Singer Sargent in 1884. It was shown at the Salon in Paris and caused such an outrage that he would eventually leave the country and settle in England. But before I get started, I've noticed that most of you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, and this would be a perfectly good time to do that because it's just one click at the bottom of this video on that little button there, and well, another one if you hit that little bell icon as well. That's useful because then you get notified whenever I post new videos. So if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and also don't forget to hit the like button as well. Now, John Singer Sargent was more or less American. I say that because his parents were American, but he was born in Italy, in Florence, and lived most of his life in Europe. But he was an American citizen. He was a hugely successful painter of mostly portraits with an enormous production. He made some 900 oil paintings and over 2,000 watercolors, and was quite possibly the leading portrait painter of his generation. And in the late 1870s he came to Paris and started his business as a portrait painter. He was doing well, making a name for himself, but as an ambitious artist he wanted to break through. Like most of his colleagues, at first he would simply get his commissions through word of mouth, or perhaps he could advertise, but really getting known meant that you needed what we would now call exposure. And the way to do that was to be seen at the Salon. Those were those, at the time, annual exhibitions held in the Louvre and a few pavilions in the area, but these salons were big. They had thousands of entries, and that meant thousands of paintings that people would walk by. So if you wanted to get known through the Salon, you needed something that stood out. And that's why he wanted to make one very spectacular portrait and enter it into the Salon, so he would get that exposure and hopefully be an instant celebrity painter. Now, he had already done that before, enter portraits, and he had received honorable mentions. One of those paintings that he had entered and had been accepted was called Portrait d'Enfant, which we now know as The Daughters of Edward Darley Boit. And this had been a lovely, unconventional group portrait of children, of girls dressed in their white pinafores. These are dresses that are quite plain. They're probably the sort of cover dresses that girls would wear over their regular clothing while playing, so they wouldn't get their expensive stuff dirty. And this one had been well received, and because it had been well received, he was allowed to send in another painting the next year that could not be refused by the jury. You see, there was a jury that would pre-select what was to be shown at the Salon, and out of tens of thousands of entries, only a few thousand would actually make it. Now, one of the people he had portrayed was this man called Dr. Pozzi. And this is the portrait he made for him. Pozzi was what you might call a ladies' man. He was famous, or rather infamous, for his affairs with women, some of whom were married, and he was also a well-known gynecologist. Not only was he successful at his job, but he's apparently also seen as a pioneer of modern gynecology. He focused on reproductive safety and the dignity of women. But he was also an art collector, known for his good taste in, well, art. So when this man commissioned a portrait from John Singer Sargent, he had to bring his A game, and let's face it, he brought it. We see him in this full-length portrait, which is extraordinary because at the time, as now, most portraits would be from the waist up or 3/4, but not full length. And we see him in this robe, in this wonderful red, and he's standing amongst these red velvet curtains in this pose that looks both manly and gentle at the same time. No wonder he liked it. Now, this man, Dr. Pozzi, according to the gossip at the time, was having an affair with a lady called Virginie Amélie Piere Gautreau. But this is just gossip, we can't be sure. She was what you might call a socialite in Paris. Some might call her a professional beauty. She was American, she came from a wealthy family in New Orleans, and there her family had made money in, well, let's say agriculture. Her father had fought in the American Civil War on the Confederate side. He was a major and died at the very bloody Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee in, I think, 1862. At some point after the war, Virginie and her mother had moved to Paris and eventually married a wealthy banker and shipping magnate named Piere Gautreau. But her beauty apparently caused quite a few men to adore her, and it led her to having several affairs that we actually more or less know of. And we know these things because of the tabloids of the time. There were these gossip sheets sold everywhere that talked about the gossip in high society, and she was one of the regular subjects. And French culture at the time was kind of open to the idea of affairs. People had them semi-openly. I mean, I suppose the amorous reputation of the French wasn't completely unfounded. Now, John Singer Sargent knew of her because she was this well-known beauty, and she would be the perfect model for that spectacular portrait that he had envisioned. The trouble was that he had not been the first painter to want to portray her. Several others had tried to get her to do it, to pose for them, for exactly the same reason as John Singer Sargent wanted it. But she'd always refused them. There's actually some stories of painters that would follow her around or stalk her even to get her poser, but she just didn't want to. But now, Sargent had a great introduction, because Pozzi was very happy with his portrait and may very well have been the one to introduce Sargent to Piere Gautreau. And with such an introduction, how could she say no? So it's quite possible that that is the reason she finally agreed to pose for that portrait. Now, over the course of the year 1883, he tried to get her to pose in several sessions, and these things would take time. Now, you might imagine that someone had to stand still for hours on end, but that's not how most portrait painters worked, because if you want to cater to a wealthy clientele, you have to make life a little bit more comfortable for them. And a painter with the skills of someone like John Singer Sargent would have his subjects sit or stand or walk around and mostly spend time with him. So he would observe them while they did stuff like maybe read, something like that. And when he would find a pose or a look that he liked, he could ask her to hold that pose for a bit and make a quick sketch. But even so, she would still have to sit still for some time so he could sketch her face. Posing sessions could take hours at a time, and she made every excuse possible to avoid them. Much later, art historians have often said that she lacked the discipline of posing, but I completely sympathize. It's boring, and this was not her project. She never asked for a portrait. He wanted to make one. But the trouble was she kept cancelling appointments, being hard to reach because she had social engagements, so for half a year nothing really happened. Much to the aggravation of John Singer Sargent, of course. But eventually she invited him to come and stay with her and her husband in their vacation home in Brittany. There he got to spend lots of time with her and make sketches of her in her daily life. And this is, I suppose, when they decided on what dress she would wear for the portrait. And she could move around in it while he sketched. And that's how we get these wonderful graphite and watercolor sketches where she's wearing the same dress, but she's obviously sitting down to read something. She's not in the same pose. But you can see that he was already getting to the way he wanted her to hold her head. And I would guess, I don't know, this is pure conjecture, but it seems logical that they would decide on dresses and she would wear them. But this dress is obviously an evening dress because that would make for the best and most spectacular look. And he would have to paint her or sketch her during the day, when the light was at its best. She had, by the way, this very pale complexion that we know she enhanced with lavender colored powder. And you can see that he more or less captured that in the tone of her skin. I know, by the way, that many portrait painters would portray their sitters and their costumes separately. A sitter would only come in for the face and then leave whatever they wanted to wear on the portrait with the painter, and they would hang it off a mannequin. And they could place that mannequin in any position they would want to get the clothing right. Because this is work, it takes a long time and the sitter doesn't have to be there for it. But from all the sketches we know that she actually wore the dress while posing. Now, John Singer Sargent definitely wanted it to be a full-length portrait because portraits are meant to be life-sized or almost life-sized, and he needed a large painting to stand out from all the others at the Salon. And of course because it would make a more spectacular picture. And that's why we see her here standing full length, I suppose as if she's going out for the evening. She just rests her hand on the side table next to her. In her other hand she has a fan, and you can barely see it because it's as black as her dress. At first, when it was first shown, even before the Salon had opened, one of her shoulder straps was painted as if it had slipped off of her shoulder. There's still a sketch where we see that version, which is now in the Tate gallery in London. But apparently either she or perhaps Sargent himself decided that it had to be changed. So at the very last minute that strap was added to the painting as on her shoulder. And I'm not too sure why. Was it too sexy, or did she just look less composed that way? Because the strap wasn't actually necessary. The dress had steel wires and whalebone in it to keep it upright. The straps are purely ornamental. And of course, the cut of the dress, the way the dress looks, it accentuates her forms and her figure, probably even exaggerates them. She seems to have an almost impossible hourglass figure, and the shape of the dress also helps to enhance her bosom. Her nose, by the way, has been made a little bit more pointy than it really was. That is, compared to the photographs we know of her. But as we will see, people found it close enough to what she looked like that they could actually recognize her. There are, by the way, two little details in the portrait that may or may not have any sort of significance. See, she's wearing a tiara in the shape of a half moon. And a half moon mounted on the head is an attribute of the goddess Diana or Artemis, goddess of the hunt and of the night, but also known for her purity and virginity. While the table that she leans on has legs in the shape of sirens. And those were creatures from mythology that would seduce anyone, but particularly sailors, and drag them down with them. So we might say that there's two very different and suggestive details there. And as far as we know, she was perfectly happy with the portrait until it was exhibited at the Salon. And it was exhibited anonymously, that is, it was exhibited under the name Madame asterisk asterisk asterisk, as to say, an anonymous lady. But she was recognized, and very much so. So the gossip tabloids had a field day making up all kinds of new stories about it and fueling the scandals around her. Her mother apparently begged Sargent to withdraw the portrait, but he refused, and I suppose for two reasons. One is that there would be no point. I mean, the cat was out of the bag. Everyone had seen it. The articles had been written, and there's no point in hiding anything if everyone has seen it. And the other reason, of course, was that the painting was doing exactly what he had hoped it would do. It caused a stir. There were articles in every newspaper, even serious ones, about it, and there were discussions between columnists in these paintings, all about him. His name was made. But he did consent in trying to make it more of an anonymous painting, so he changed the name to Madame X, as if that makes any difference. All in all, he was very happy with it. And if she was unhappy with it, it was only because of the scandals that had already surrounded her. And we're not at all sure if she minded it. But for Sargent, it had an unexpected effect. Instead of becoming famous within high society as the top portrait painter, he was ostracized. Nobody commissioned portraits from him after this. The portrait itself wasn't sold, but that's because that had been the deal that he had made with her. He was to keep the portrait. But after a while of having very few or even no commissions at all, the scandal actually forced John Singer Sargent to leave Paris. He moved to London, where this exact same story made him very popular. He exhibited the painting in his own studio to show potential clients. And the Brits probably thought, oh well, this is of course a French lady and we all know what they're like. And then happily ordered their own portrait with Sargent. So although he had to leave Paris, this painting helped make his reputation first in London and then in the US, where for the rest of his life he would paint portraits of high society, including several US presidents. For her part, she withdrew from public life, but only for a short while, because very soon she resumed her life as before. And we know this because within a year she appeared in the tabloids again with new scandals of her own. And besides that, the experience must not have been a totally negative one, because afterwards she posed for various other portrait painters as well, like this one by Gustave Courtois and this one by Antonia della Gandara. So apparently she wasn't even put off by the whole thing. Now John Singer Sargent kept a portrait of Madame X in his studio, first in London, later in the US, and eventually he sold it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, saying that it was probably the best thing he had ever done. And today you can still find it in that collection. By the way, Dr. Pozzi is in the US as well. He is now in the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles. Now, I can perfectly well understand that you now want to run off and go and see them for yourself, but before you do, don't forget to like this video, and if you haven't yet done so, please subscribe to this channel. When you do that, don't forget to hit the bell icon, because then you'll be notified when I post videos. And if you would really like to help my channel grow, please be so kind as to share this video with anyone you might know that might be interested. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.